the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, that is, once again, seems to only happen when Republicans are in Congress and Democrats are in the White House, manufacturing a crisis around the federal debt ceiling. That impasse continues, and interestingly, and I call this out because I think it's interesting, in many respects, it's manifesting earlier than we anticipated because of issues very familiar to all of us, and that's because of delayed tax receipts. There was an estimate that in October we may hit that debt ceiling. Now the expectation from Janet Yellen and others is that will happen sooner. The delayed tax receipts is an uncertainty not just in the macro as it relates to the federal debt ceiling issues, but here in the state of California. We had, as you may recall, serious challenges as it relates to major disaster declarations associated with the floods. Across the country, there were other climate-induced extreme weather events leading to similar major disaster declarations that also impacted their ability to collect tax receipts in a timely manner. As a consequence, the IRS established a relationship to the issues of tax collection, to the issues of these emergencies, and extended through October the tax deadline, which means for all of us, the cash receipts are in doubt. For us, it's roughly $42 billion, and I think this is the actual number. It might be worth writing down. $42 billion of delayed tax receipts we project. This is imprecise science. It's estimates. $42 billion that will be collected later in the year. So we're going into a budget in a way we've never gone in the budget before. It's impacting, again, the country as it relates to the federal debt ceiling. Interestingly, climate change having an impact on debt ceiling conversations, which has global economic consequences, is just another reminder of how serious the issue of climate policy is. More on that later. But the delayed tax receipts as it relates to California, $42 billion we project in October. That is broken down primarily in two categories: personal income tax, which we project around $28.4 billion, or 32% of all of the personal income tax, or 23%, excuse me, and about 32% of the corporate taxes will projected to be included as receipts in October, making up the balance of the $42 billion. So with that uncertainty, we stack on top two additional. One is around financial institutions and what's happened obviously here in California and across the country, notably in New York. Interest rates, you saw last week, I think it was a 10th interest rate increase since March of 2022. We're at 5.25% interest rates as it relates to credit policies, as it relates to startups, as it relates to the impacts of financial institutions, the direct cause and effect as it relates to SBP and, of course, First Republic. The broader implications are certainly highlighted appropriately here as uncertainties, and, of course, the big one, which is recession. And the question you're going to ask, and I'll just answer so we can get to other questions, is no, we are not modeling in the multi-year or even in the short run a recession, but we are pulling out a deep understanding of even a mild recession in terms of its economic impacts. A mild recession, it's a number familiar to you, about a $20 billion hit in that next fiscal year. A moderate recession, we're looking at an additional $40 billion impact in terms of projected shortfalls. And if you extend that out over a multi-year period, you're in the $100+ billion area. And that is an uncertainty that we must take very soberly and seriously as it relates to the macroeconomic headwinds. You stack everything above that, you stack prospects as it relates to monetary policy and Fed policy and the impacts we're already seeing at the UI and the impacts we're seeing on employment more broadly across this country. You saw those in the newest numbers that just came out. We are walking into a budget where we need to maintain our prudence, and we need to prepare not just for the short term, but the medium and long term. And so with that, reserves continue to matter. And that's why we are committed to increasing our reserves pursuant to the rules and regulations established under Prop 2, but also under the rules of engagement as it relates to addressing the issues of resilience and prudence and volatility. Just a reminder, in January, we set out record reserves in the January budget of 35.6. Importantly, you will see here an increase of $1.6 billion in reserves in the May revise. So we're going up, not down, in total number of reserves. That's primarily represented in the rainy day fund for public education, pursuant to Prop 98, Prop 2, and its relationship. We could talk more about that, but there are more resources in that bucket. We have hit the statutory 10% on the rainy day fund, so that's capped, and there's a spillover that we are putting into our retirement liabilities, meaning paying them down, PERS and unfunded healthcare liability. You'll see an increase from the January budget. Here's the January budget. The past 4 years, $10.1 billion we've invested in paying down these retirement liabilities. I don't know of another jurisdiction in the country that's invested this kind of money in terms of paying down its retirement liabilities. In the next 4 years, you'll see that number increase from $7.1 to $7.4 billion. In the budget year, you'll see that increase. I'll go back from $1.9 billion to $2.3. So an additional $400 million in paying down retirement liabilities. You stack those two, it's about $2 billion of additional investment into holding the line, paying down long-term liabilities, and addressing our needs, potential needs, if we enter into a recession, to be able to pull the trigger on the rainy day fund and bolstering the broader rainy day funds, including education. But here's foundationally what I want to reinforce, and we'll move through this. Will be a much quicker presentation than in the past. Preserving investments. This is foundational, and this goes to our values, and I've been very mindful of how concerned people have been about the impact on these fundamental core issues: education, homeless, housing, healthcare, mental health, climate policy, public safety broadly, and of course the issues of economic development, jobs, workforce development. And so you'll see as we lay out this presentation that we are committed to preserving those investments, particularly around transforming. That's one of the most, I think, interesting and exciting things happening in education in America today. Not the book banning and the free speech and the criminalization of free speech and criminalizing teachers and librarians in other states, but the work to transform the educational system and give real choice and voice to parents and make sure that we're providing support for professional development. That transformation continues. Prop 98 funding is $106.8 billion, modestly impacted versus the January budget. I'll get to that in a moment. And I say modestly in this respect. You may recall, and here's the number that matters I think matters disproportionately, and that's what's the per pupil investment. In January, we had $23,723. By the way, the year prior, just so you get your arms around it, last year, current fiscal year, last year's budget act that was approved, we're in the current fiscal year, $22,893. So in January, we projected it to go up. Now, obviously, the economic issues, we project that to go down, but modestly, $17. So de facto, pretty much the same, $23,706. If you considered the per pupil below $17,444, if this is approved, the Prop 98 per pupil will be the highest in state history. That's the Prop 98. Total per pupil among the highest in history. So despite the $2 billion is 108.8, 106.8, Prop 98, we're still maintaining unprecedented and historic per pupil investments. And I always think it's important, where were we a decade or so ago? You know, you're seeing 3x increase in terms of overall investments as it relates to our per pupil funding. 8.13 was what referred to as and this is where only insiders pay attention. If you are paying attention and you're wondering what I'm talking about, it's because you actually are paying attention. LCFF COLA. So the local funding formula, and what we refer to as the control funding formula, has a COLA, an annual adjustment. Last year, I think it was 6.56%, if my memory serves, but fact check that. January, we projected 8.13. It actually goes up in the May revised to 8.22%. So the COLA under LCFF in May proposed in the budget to the legislature, 8.22%. As it relates to transforming public education, I just want to highlight the commitments we maintain because they're unprecedented. If we isolated one of them, we would celebrate even progress just on advancing before and after school and extending the school day, 9 hours of curriculum. That $4 billion commitment, unprecedented, to fully fund before and after school and reimagining the school year and school day, that full commitment continues. The work we're doing on building community schools and creating capacity and extending the narrative beyond just the walls within the educational construct, but engaging the community more formally and substantively. That $4 billion, we continue. The special education money, the behavioral health, unprecedented support in U.S. history, certainly state history, to continue to provide a workforce and to provide those points of contact, wellness centers for physical, yes, but also adolescent mental health, foundational. On the learning recovery, we pulled back a bit because of pandemic focus on that. And as we architect all of these other supports, we feel that more support ultimately is provided, and that is indeed an adjustment, but one based upon the recommendations of our team. Educator workforce, continue to put unprecedented investments in professional development, retaining, not just recruiting teachers, and we're starting to see, even at the CSU, we're starting to see more people seek the opportunity to participate in an outstanding career as a public educator. We're starting to turn the tide a bit. That is a stubborn issue, not naive, but we're seeing a little bit of some optimism. Arts, we have the benefit of Prop 28 funding to offset some modest adjustments there. The universal school meals, my wife just walked in, always right to highlight, 2 full meals a day. Thank you, Senator Skinner, for her incredible leadership in this space. We're providing additional $300 million, new money, in the May revise to fully fund the utilization and the investments in that space. That's represented in the $1.6 billion, slightly higher than you've seen. No delays in transitional kindergarten, fully committed, but we haven't seen the utilization rates in TK. It's been highlighted by many, certainly highlighted by our own data, but that commitment we maintain. We'll continue to do more to get more of our 4-year-olds into TK. The equity multiplier, foundational, it's a commitment, and we're following through on keeping it, as well as keeping our commitment and promises to the UCs and CSUs. And this is meaningful. At a time when you're looking at a shortfall, we are making unprecedented 5% increases in the base investments in our institutions of higher learning. And I continue to say this because it's true. These are conveyor belts for talent. This is what separates our game from the game played everywhere else in the world, not just in the United States. The quality of education, the UC system and their CSU, and our community colleges. But that commitment, that MOU, that partnership for achievement, that framework we're fully committed to, including providing additional support to increase resident enrollment at the UCs. And you'll see that represented here, additional investment. We want more Californians accepted to the UC system. I can't tell you how many folks, and those are the parents of kids who didn't get into the UC applauding. And obviously you see here a debt service line. I'll get to that in a moment. We will be converting some of the cash to revenue bonds, and we're providing the offset to the CSU and UC, primarily for student housing and those historic student housing advancements, as a way to avoid cutting real programs, providing the same support and services, but obviously we'll pick up from the state general fund those costs, so it's not a burden on either system. That student housing is represented, that $4 billion, in 2 appropriations, or at least 2 programs, I should say. Some member McCarty, others that were leaders in the $1.8 billion on the student revolving loans, the $2.2 billion or so that we compromised with the legislature. I wanted to get to 3. We got to 2.2 last year. In the prior year, sort of stacking support for student housing, because we want to address the issues of cost, full cost of attendance, not just tuition, full cost of attendance. And that's the issue of bringing down the cost of housing, addressing the issues, obviously, of financial aid, but that's subsidizing, and addressing broader issues around scholarships into the middle class, getting people engaged. That College Corps program, as you know, we have more volunteers than the entire Peace Corps in the state of California. I couldn't be more proud of those programs. We had a big event right here where we swore in 3,750 people, virtually and physically, in this room to take advantage of those college scholarships, 450 hours, all we ask. Opportunity, responsibility. We provide something, and you contribute to the life of your city, our state, and our nation. And so the College Corps is preserved. Of course, we want to deal with the racket that is textbooks, and you'll continue to hear me say the racket related to textbooks because it continues to be. And then we could talk about textbooks that are selling their souls and rewriting history another day in other states. That's a preview of the next few weeks and my focus on what's going on in states like Florida and Texas that are literally whitewashing history. College, of course, is one thing. If you have a child, it's hard to provide at least quality of imagination for a lot of children. That's why those college savings accounts are so foundational. And we're not backing away. We fully implemented that for 3.4 million people. Anyway, I'm proud of this slide. Debt-free college continues to be our top priority, and we're continuing to accelerate those efforts. Homelessness, we're not backing away at all. Fully funding, full commitment to move forward in that $15.3 billion, address the issue of cleaning up these damn encampments. $750 million just in that space. You'll see the home key money, room key money, infrastructure on bridge housing, and community care expansion, which is a fancy way of saying boarding care homes, and other flexible funding, including that $1 billion. This is all about accountability. And you'll see in the May revise of the trade bill, accountability, and that extends to housing affordability. It's about accountability. We extended a lawsuit, as you saw, not just to Huntington Beach, but to Elk Grove. I want to get ahead of myself, and if you ask, I won't answer today, so forgive me for previewing it, but it's important. There are others on that list, and we are prepared, working with the AG's office, has been doing an amazing job in this space. It's all about accountability. These are the rules of the road. Legally binding 2.5 million units, legally binding. And we are going to assert our rights, and we're going to assert the rule of law in the context of actually achieving these goals. And that's why these SEQA reform bills in partnership with the legislature have been foundational, 20 of them so far, and Housing Accountability Unit that we stood up continues to do an outstanding job, and streamlining, which I'll get to, is something that is front and center in this presentation and our work over the next year or two, not just in housing, but across the board in terms of getting projects built. When we talk about preserving investments, we also talking about building a quality framework, not just to address the issue of your physical health, but the integration of your brain health. And we're going to continue to accelerate and improve our investments in this space. We stack all kinds of first-in-the-nation efforts, CalAIM, this multi-year commitment. We maintain it, the $8 billion in the behavioral health services and housing. We maintain those funds over the multi-year. You see the work we're doing to expand healthcare regardless of your immigration status. Stark contrast to the rhetoric of today, yesterday, tomorrow, as it relates to what's going on in this country. It's a point of pride and privilege that we continue to maintain that commitment in the May revise. Care Court, we have an additional 130. You see that $291 million. We have an additional $139.5 million, just shy of 140 in the May revise, because we're bringing in to the cohort of our early pilots in October, LA, and we're addressing the needs and requests from the courts themselves in terms of what they're looking for. You may see that number at the bottom was $100 million in January. The CalRx around insulin, $30 at cost, not subsidized. You're not paying for it on the back end, as is the case with a lot of the federal subsidies. Naloxone, we want to pull into that. There's a $30 million additional investment in bringing naloxone and doing our own manufacturing of Narcan, naloxone equivalents in the state. On the behavioral health front, I want to highlight, as we have highlighted in San Diego with the pro tem, I want to thank her for incredible leadership in this space, and Senator Eggman, so many others that have really been leaders in this space. The behavioral health bond, we're fully committed to advancing this. We want to do two things: modernize Prop 63. It's 20 years old, the Mental Health Services Act. As you may recall, housing was not a component of that act, nor was the issue of behavioral health, meaning issues related to substance abuse in relationship, to behavioral health, meaning substance abuse itself was not alone an eligible benefit of the Mental Health Services Act. So we want to address that. We want to focus on the housing components. We want to make it more consistent with CalAIM, part of a broader three-legged stool, and with our outreach efforts, and that's why that reform is critical. Of course, big part of the bond is about addressing capacity. Minimum of 6,000 units, home-based units, cottage-like units, and campus units. Clinically supported. We're not going back to the old days. Modern, state-of-the-art settings, and of course, doing what we must. And I want to thank so many remarkable leaders in this space, housing for homeless veterans in relationship to their serious behavioral health issues that obviously this country continues to struggle with and our state continues to struggle with. So that is a component, and no is the answer. We're not looking for this bond to then cut the programs that were on that homeless page as it relates to the commitments we're making for board and care, et cetera. It's not to substitute, it's additive as it relates to this budget. Climate commitment, we maintain that $48 billion that we set forth in January. You see the breakdown in the key areas. You also see in the bottom of this slide a commitment to do a climate bond, which I have maintained that commitment publicly on multiple occasions. We want to formalize that, working with members of the legislature. Eddie Garcia and others have been talking a lot about this, and we want to size it right. We don't have, nor on the mental health services bond, we don't have the exact number yet. We are working with the legislature in real time to land both of those, and that will allow us to do even more in this space than was proposed in January and is proposed in the May revise. Water as a component, I just wanted to highlight because it's foundational: safe, clean, and affordable drinking water, continuing to maintain our commitments in that space, consolidating wells, continuing to build on the work we've been doing over the last few years, but take it to the next level. Habitat, watersheds, drought support, we're not out of the woods on that. We continue to maintain investments in that space. The work we're doing in terms of ag and conversions and supporting conservation, that $8.5 billion commitment continues. Here's the new commitment: flood protection. And we have a posture of drought to flood, reinforcing this weather whiplash, reinforcing my connection to the debt ceiling, all issues related to tax collections, the reality of how climate impacts us in every way, shape, or form, reinforced by the fact that we are pivoting and transitioning, including $125 million of flood contingency funding that we're shifting from drought. It's reflected in this slide, but there's $290 million of new investments above the $202 million that we presented in January, specifically in this space. I'll remind you, since 2019, $1.3 billion has been invested more broadly in terms of flood protection. This is not a novel strategy in terms of recognizing the acuity of the challenges, but we do recognize the immediacy situationally of some of them, including Corcoran Levee, which we announced yesterday in the $17 million. I find it absolutely extraordinary, but not surprising, that you have representatives in the Central Valley that opposed federal funding for infrastructure and are not providing support for their constituents in their backyard as it relates to flood protection. I'm proud that the state of California is doing that job, and I'm proud that working with members of the legislature that we advance that proposal, and I hope the legislature adopts it so we can continue the work on that levee and address the issues around the Tulare Lake Basin. Issues in California, keeping them safe from floods, extends to keeping them safe in every other way, and that's why I want to remind people of the investments that we committed to in January, the investments we are maintaining in May as it relates to our public safety efforts to support victim services. $50 million of new money in officer wellness and training, We've asked a lot from our officers. That's not just rhetoric we use during memorials or Memorial Week. We're putting real resources in that space, nonprofit security grants. We're maintaining the commitment that we had. I know that the legislature would like to see increase in that commitment. We look forward to working with them through the next month or so in terms of landing the budget. I'm mindful of those needs, and I'm certainly mindful of the issue of combating fentanyl. And I just remind all of you what we did over the course of the last 12 months as the DOJ is now hiring in the new fentanyl unit that's been created, the task forces that we've created, the work we've been doing all around the state of California, including amplifying some of that work in the city and county of San Francisco, the work the CHP is doing in this space, and the 144 National Guard men and women that we put out on the border as it relates to issues related to drug interdiction and fentanyl interdiction, and work we did recently to add an additional 16 members that will be doing a lot of the security screening around their large-scale X-ray machines. All of that as part of our public safety efforts. We take those actions seriously. We want to continue to amplify those efforts. When I say continue to amplify those efforts, it's reflected in this new slide, an additional $172 million above the investments that we promoted, which were significant in January. And this is for the naloxone distribution project, 130,000 people. We have to dedupe the 130,000, so I want to be cautious. 130,000 incidents where we have saved a life pursuant to the commitments the taxpayers and the legislature advanced through this naloxone distribution project. It works. It saves lives. We want to build on it, additional $172 million. We have grants for education, test strips. Obviously, we're doing what we pledged to do as it relates to overdose medication in our K through 12 education system. And I noted what we want to do and we're proposing to do with CalRx, move beyond just insulin to naloxone production within the state to lower the costs and increase access and availability. So stepping up our commitment further, both on enforcement, substance abuse treatment, and obviously intervention and education. As it relates to more broadly issues that define our success or failure, the foundation to which everything else is laid, and that is risk takers, putting everything on the line for riches and new beginnings, small business men and women, people that make big bets in this state and provide opportunities for all of us. That's the jobs economic framework, obviously foundationally supported by those small business risk takers. And I just want to note that 327,000 businesses have been beneficiaries of those grants, not loans, small business grants, $4.2 billion that's been invested. We're committed, working with the legislature to land on the film tax credits. Thank you, Wendy Correa, all others, for their hard work in that space. We continue to recognize you can't have an economic development strategy without a workforce development strategy, and that's why we're committed to continue to do more in that space. By the way, we are adding back from January. I got a lot of feedback, and I appreciated it, as it relates to women apprenticeships in construction. We're adding that $40 million back. There was a healthcare component. There's a broad healthcare component, but there was one particular component where there was $40 million. We're adding that back, so that's $80 million that we have augmented from January back into the workforce development slide. On child care, I know there's a lot of attention on this. There should be. Trust me, I'm looking at my wife. There should be. As it relates to our expansion, we're still committed to the 200,000. We've done more than any other state in this country. We provided a new bargaining unit, and I'm proud of the fact that we led on that effort, and I'm proud of the Women's Caucus and others for codifying that and making sure that we met the expectation that we all have as it relates to empowering our workforce and demanding better living conditions and wages. With that in mind, we're in process of bargaining. We did some short-term efforts as it relates to stipends, as it relates to fee waivers, and I'm proud of that, and I thank the legislature for that quick action. And we are committed, $6+ billion over the period in the budget, and of course, $3 billion of that's just general fund to that child care expansion. But I know there's a lot of desire and a lot of energy in that space. and we have a lot of work to do to implement and apply. But I put it under the economic and job development because it continues to need to be in this space. Child care is foundational to getting people back to work, particularly women, but particularly addressing the labor shortage that continues in the state, in this country. Child care needs to be front and center in that debate and conversation. Other issues we've highlighted: travel and tourism. You saw those new numbers coming back. We're getting back to record numbers. That's an exciting and long overdue, I don't know, criteria, position, condition. Just glad to see people returning back to California. Still have a lot more work to do with foreign travelers, but that investment has really paid off, and I highlight it because I think it deserves to be highlighted, including our competitiveness under the Cal Grants program that's allowed us to recruit and retain businesses against other states that are more aggressive than ever in competing against the state of California. One of the efforts that we're focused on to be aggressive, more so than ever, is around reconciling disparities within the state. Remind everybody that we're the size of 21 state populations combined. It's the largest rural state in America. Some of my friends say, boy, you really need to spend time in rural America. I say, well, it's interesting. I've spent 55 years in this state. Know it as well as more than most. Largest number of hunters in America reside in California. Forestry jobs, California. Ag, no one comes close. So we recognize the importance of rural Californians, so much so we put $600 million to build off Fresno Drive and BK3 or B3K as relates to the work they're doing in Fresno and Kern, working on these partnerships, public-public, public-private partnerships, leveraging that $600 million for local bottom-up, region rising together resilience. We also had a fund on local sustainability as it relates to backfilling some property tax losses related to the transition to clean and green future. We have a particular focus in the May Revise on the incredible work that's been done in Fresno and the incredible planning that has been done that allows us to make a commitment to Fresno in particular to accelerate that effort because they're teed up and ready to do something transformational. And so that's reflected in that reference to Fresno revitalization in relationship to the local sustainability fund that was previously approved, thank you, by the legislature. You see increase, there's a modest increase, understandably and appropriately so, for business grants for ag that have been impacted by conditions and floods. Oil and gas workers, I remind people the commitment the legislature we've made as relates to oil and gas workers to skill build and to cap wells and to take those same skills and same opportunities as we move forward with transition. We talk in terms of a just transition, we mean business, and it's not just rhetoric, and we recognize we have more work to do in that space. So you came here not for all of that. You came here to answer the question, well, how are you going to balance the $9.3 billion? And here is what we laid out. It's not just the 9.3, it's the 31.5 as it relates to January and May. You recall, this is a very familiar slide. No reason for me to go over it. If you have questions, finance is coming up. They can talk to you about what we talked about for a 2-hour period in January around laying out the January solutions on the 22.5. By the way, good government and efficiencies. Don't think for a second. I know people roll their eyes, say, well, what about making sure you're running a more efficient operation? We're maintaining those efficiencies. And we focused on codifying those efficiencies, and we believe that tax dollars should be well invested, well spent, and we believe we could do better and do more to be more efficient organization, and we take that seriously, and I highlight that as I highlighted it in January. But here is the question. You posed privately, and I will pose publicly and answer on the $9.3 billion. So, not dissimilar to the January framework as it relates to fund shifts, funding delays, reductions. You'll see one thing that's missing, and that's a good thing in the January versus the May, is there's no trigger cuts. So we substantially are closing this budget, or at least proposing, recognizing this is a proposal to the legislature, the following. I will break down now each item. The borrowing and revenue side of things. We have an MCO opportunity. MCO is well established. It's referred to as a tax. It's a partnership with the federal government and private sector. The MCO is a $19.4 billion. This is actually worth writing down. The commitment on the MCO from April 1st this year to December 31st, 2026. Within that bracketed frame, about $19.4 billion of revenue, additional revenue that we'll be able to draw down in partnership with the private sector and our federal partners. That's significant. That was not represented fully in the January budget, is represented significantly here in the May revise. So much so that it represents $2.5 billion more in terms of solving for the budget year ahead than was presented and proposed in January. The total number is $3.4 billion in the next fiscal year. $11.1 billion extended to increase over the next many years as we work through the details for primary care physicians and others, increase reimbursement rates, which is critical for our Medicaid, Medi-Cal recipients. So this is something I think will be well received. We will work with the legislature on the details of that package, particularly $11.1 billion. For the short term, we've laid out our proposal, working with many legislative leaders, but we have more work to do in this space, but it is a significant part of not just the solution short term, but a long-term revenue stream to address and to enhance and advance our efforts to secure and support our healthcare system, particularly hospitals and others. I'll be talking more about our hospital proposal that, well, not just ours, our partnership. We advanced with the legislature on early action in a bill that's on my desk in that space. It's represented in terms of this discussion in this slide, also represented in terms of the budget that we're presenting here today. Other funds, as it relates to fund borrowing, team can lay out in more detail. They're familiar, meaning they've been used in the past. It won't have a direct impact on services. Relates to general fund shifts. Accordingly, we have some shifts, about $1.1 billion into the climate bond as it relates to climate resiliency that we're proposing. You have shifts of $635 million, correct me if I'm off, to greenhouse gases related to ZEVs, but that's to the GHG fund, our cap and trade fund. You have what I referenced earlier, which was the student housing primarily for CSU and UC, with bonds that they will issue, will backfill them in terms of the interest related to those bonds. That's represented in the general fund shifts. Unspent funds, and this is interesting, not ongoing, one time, but these are funds that would naturally be swept up anyway, that we are fast tracking and prioritizing. Let me give you just a couple examples as my mind, as they come to my mind. $200 million, for example, in the middle class tax cuts. By the way, $18.1 billion. Eat your heart out. No other state in U.S. history has ever provided $18.1 billion over a 2-year period tax credits, tax rebates. We just gave back $18.1 billion, about 9.3 this last year. We have about $200 million that we can sweep back from that, that we had budgeted that we can use for this. We have about $150 million, just shy. It's 149.4 or 6, I can't recall. $150 million for utility arrearages that would also be swept up. You'll get a sense of it. I think 280 in CalWorks as it relates to county relationships. So we're sweeping up a lot of unspent money. We say reductions, but they're not related to ongoing issues. Finance team could talk more about the remaining items. Those are just some examples, including funding delays, which, as you recall in the past, delays are not denials. Some may perceive delays as denials. I'm not naive, and that's part of the give and take. And you, I'm sure, members of the media will express yourself in that space in particular as it relates to the punditry around the budget and the engagement with the legislature. But these are issues that I look forward to working with and I think are appropriately discussed, but also under the circumstances, I think appropriate in terms of trying to find a balanced solution here and maintain our fiscal discipline. As it relates to issues that you may have seen highlighted in that slide. I mentioned the $1.6 billion more in reserves in total, but you may have seen on the bottom of that, it said safety net reserve from $900 million to $450. We are sweeping $450 million from the safety net reserve to help offset costs associated with Medi-Cal and CalWORKs. We think it's exactly why that fund and reserve was created, and it will provide the opportunity to continue to provide the services that we've come to expect and the services that the legislature championed over the course of the last number of years. I know I've been speaking faster than normal, but I'm trying not to speak as long as normal. And so we are here now near the end to sort of sum up in an area that I've alluded to, but I want to highlight. I think a big part of what I want to communicate today is not just resilience, prudence, not just the work that we have done that allows us to be in a position where we can weather the volatility. And by the way, and this is a number also I think I'd write down. I have written it down. 177.7. 177.7. That's the last 2 fiscal years, the operating surplus in the state that does not include ARPA money from the feds. It's just extraordinary. You saw that 11.3% of the capital gains in 2021. That got trued up because those numbers in 2021, 101.4 billion of the 177.7, 76.3 in the prior year, 2021, of operating surplus. Just extraordinary. You knew it. You saw everybody selling capital gains. They saw what's happening in monetary policy. All of this, again, predictable. And that's why we maintain the discipline in terms of our fiscal posture. That's why I vetoed so many bills outside the budget last year. Billions of dollars. By some estimate, $22 billion of ongoing spending, or at least one-time spending, $10 billion in ongoing. Right now, we don't want to just build our reserves and our resiliency, but we also recognize the urgency of rebuilding this state.